Hi everyone, I'm Sinead from the Men Engage Global Secretariat, and good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to today's session called Improving Coordinated Community Response to Perpetrators of Domestic Violence with Alessandra Pounds and Heinrich Geldschläger. I hope I pronounced that right. Do get involved in social media. The hashtag is #Ubuntu Symposio or Symposium or Symposio Ubuntu in Spanish. And that's it for me for now. I'll pass you over to Alessandra. Enjoy.
Thank you for joining us today. You are all unmuted. Oh no, you should be unmuted. Will they be unmuted?
I think they should have the ability to unmute themselves if they want. If anyone can't unmute themselves, do let me know and I'll get it fixed.
So we wanted to start with sort of a brief presentation. I will present myself, maybe Heinrich can introduce himself, and to know a little bit about who you are and what you're interested in, if you are familiar or not with perpetrator programs, so that we can just better assess and try and deliver the best workshop possible. My name is Alessandra Pounds. I'm the Executive Director of the European Network of the Work with Perpetrators. I've been working in the field of domestic violence for over 20 years. I started a perpetrator program in Florence, Italy. I'm also currently president of the National Network of Perpetrator Programs in Italy, and obviously engaged with the European network. Heinrich?
Yeah, hello everybody. My name is Heinrich Geldschläger. I am a psychologist working at an association called Connexus in Barcelona in Spain. We deliver services directly around gender-based violence and family violence, including the perpetrator program. We also offer training and do different research projects, one of which I will explain a bit later. I've been working in the field of gender-based violence and specifically with perpetrators of domestic violence for around 20 years now. And we're also, as Connexus, members of WWP, of the European Network for the Work with Perpetrators, where I'm also currently a board member.
So if you could just please unmute yourself and just give us a little brief idea of where you're joining us from and your organization and your interest in the on perpetrator. Your interest, if any, or non-interest, whatever.
Hello everyone, this is Bangladesh. I am work as a senior program officer in Action Aid Bangladesh, and I work for women rights and gender equity, especially in gender-based violence. And I am member of the Airlines of Bangladesh, Men Engage Airlines in Bangladesh.
And are you familiar with perpetrator programs? Nuru, are you familiar with perpetrator programs?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Okay. Laura, do you want to go next?
Hello.
Hello? Savita?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Savita. I am from India. I work as an international volunteer with voluntary service overseas in Mozambique. Because of the travel restrictions, presently I'm working from home. I have been working in the field of gender-based violence for many years, and my present project is with the adolescent girls who have dropped out of the schools, and gender-based violence is one of the important components of our project. I know about programs with perpetrators, but I haven't directly worked with such programs. So I'm more interested in knowing so that I can take the learning to my present program and even in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.
I am Rafa Soto from Spain. I'm a social worker. I have been working in a perpetrator program years ago. And now I am working more in prevention, men's and addiction.
Thank you. Laura, would you like to go?
Yes, sure. Hi, everyone. So I actually don't work in this space, but I'm considering a career. I'm just trying to figure out where I would fit best, but I'm very passionate about domestic violence and violence prevention and intervention. And I'm leaning towards men's behavior change programs. I currently work for the International Rescue Committee, but in a fundraising admin kind of role. But we also do have programs in different countries around the world working with gender-based violence. So I'm learning a lot. And in my spare time, I'm also trying to map out potentially an app to work with, basically to take like a behavior change program and implement it in an app so people can do it through self-reflection in terms of preempted questions made by experts, because I think that would help with some intervention and prevention, especially with the younger generations in terms of recognizing and just getting comfortable with being uncomfortable on this topic, but kind of taking action and learning things that they may not know about themselves and about this important work. So yeah, I'm doing a lot, thinking about a lot, but happy to be here.
Do you design apps?
No, I don't. But I think from the research that I've been doing so far, I think and the kind of feedback that I've been getting from different friends and family that I've been actively talking about, is that, you know, people never have time and it's never a good time. And I think if I could create something that, you know, they're motivated to work on, it's in like a self-development kind of mental health angle, maybe they'll make the time, even if it's just a few questions a day that they answer or take some time out to reflect. If it's 5 minutes a day, it's better than nothing. And if that helps them, you know, be like address kind of potentially harmful attitudes and behaviors, I think it really could make a difference in how they're interacting with others and the quality of life that they have for themselves as well. So yeah, I'm not an expert in this space, and I'm not an app expert, but I really see a lot of potential for this kind of tool. So yeah, I'm trying to like look into how to make that work.
That sounds really interesting.
Interesting, yeah.
We've been playing with ideas around apps with working with perpetrators, so that's something that we're interested in. Great, thanks. Valentina, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, yeah, thank you very much. So I'm Valentina from Madrid, Spain. I work at CEPAIN Foundation, and I work basically on gender-based violence prevention, not with perpetrator, but I think that it's really important, this point of view and the perspective. I feel like I don't have this other part, and I really want to have it because I think it can complete the prevention. So I'm really interested in listening to you. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Valentina. Astalo, do you want to introduce yourself? Astalo Garcia, would you like to introduce yourself? You always wonder, is he there? Is he gone for a little break? Okay, all right. So I would propose this structure. Our workshop is going to be divided in 2 parts. I'm going to do a first part that's a little bit on perpetrator programs, and then we are going to look into some practical interactions that might show certain critical aspects of what happens when perpetrator programs and women's support services don't collaborate. We'll try and give you a more sort of interactive view, and since there are not that many of us in the workshop, we can maybe comment on that and get your input. And then sort of depending on if you're interested in going into a little bit more depth, I can explain a little bit of what we've been doing with one of our projects in terms of structuring collaboration between perpetrator programs and women's support services and creating protocols. But that will sort of be up to also if that is sort of interesting for the participants. Second part of the workshop, I'm going to pass it over to Heinrich. He's going to be talking about another project that we developed together that always has to do with working with perpetrators and also with frontline professionals and how to screen for perpetrators, how they can be sent, how that can increase. That also is a really interesting project. There's some very good materials that came out of that. There's a roadmap that sort of explains and goes through how you're supposed to do this. So it might be that maybe you're a little bit more interested in that part. So I wouldn't mind keeping my presentation a little bit shorter so that you have more time for that. We'll see. We have been collaborating on both these projects. So we're quite happy sort of to share the time in any way that is most interesting for you guys that showed up today. So I'm going to share my screen now, and I'm going to start. And I'm going to do a few PowerPoint presentation, and then we'll do something more interactive, and then we'll decide together how to go forward. It's going to be a collaborative effort. So first of all, I'm just going to show you a very short video that explains what we do as a network. It's just a few seconds long, and it is a more interactive way of showing you everything that we're doing rather than sort of boring you with slides. Okay. Maybe twice as much. Okay, so those are some of the activities of the network, and I'll be glad to give you more details if you're interested. I forgot to say that at the end of the it's going to be very interactive because we have also some time in between, but sort of at any time, if you have any additional questions, then please feel free to just ask me. Based on Article 16 of the Istanbul Convention, we have a specific focus of preventive intervention and treatments in perpetrator programs. And I say this because I think it's important that we refer to this document, because in point 3, there is a specific point on the implementation and close coordination with specialist support services for victims. So that is kind of the focus of this part of the presentation, why it's important for perpetrator programs and women's support services to closely collaborate in working together. So let's start from what perpetrator intervention is and why perpetrator programs are important. We know it's quite clear that intervention for victim and children and keeping victim and children safe are essential, but it's not always as clear why we also need to have a specific focus on the abusive partner. But there's several questions for which we think that it is important to have perpetrator intervention in place. One is that an earlier intervention can prevent further harm. It's also true that in many situations, victims don't leave their abusers, and in which case, working with the perpetrator, we can reduce the harm. But it's also true that even if victims do decide to leave the perpetrators, often the abuse continues even after the perpetrator has left. So there's the risk of him harming ex-partners and children even after the relationship has ended. So also in those cases, it's important to have perpetrator programs in place to try and increase the likeliness of the violence stopping. And it's also true that we know that it's a repeated behavior. So they may go on, perpetrators may go on to new victims. I worked for 15 years in a women's support service, and there was one specific time in which at our center we had a wife, we had the ex-wife, and we had the mistress of the same man at the same time. So it's really important that that behavior stops so that there's also not this repetition of behavior. We also know that there are elements of learned behavior. So if a perpetrator doesn't change, it's possible that these patterns of behavior are going to be passed on to the next generation. So that's also a really important reason for working with perpetrators. We also think that it's important to highlight perpetrators are usually addressed as a category that's very resistant to change and tends to be using power and control in a functional way in relationships. But we also see a lot of perpetrators that actually do want to change their behaviors. They realize that violence is actually harming the people that they have next to us, and they realize that the abuse is not good for them. There's increased mental health problems, and so these are all reasons that we think for which we think that there is a need for perpetrator intervention. There is also added value to perpetrator intervention because we are not only addressing sort of the tip of the iceberg of violent behavior, which is usually what we can address with restrictive and repressive measures in which we sort of stop the activities, but just sort of momentarily until we're intervening. And with the intervention, we actually go to the hidden part of the aspect of the iceberg, trying to change structures around gender role beliefs, gender inequality, communication skills, managing emotion, and helpful thinking. And so we are contributing in a much more significant way to shifting behaviors and shifting the ways in which the men are sort of structuring their masculinities within violent behaviors. We believe that perpetrator programs are different types of perpetrator programs, and that's sort of response to today's workshop. They should be in bed with a whole community response. It takes a village to raise a child, but it also takes a village to change a perpetrator. The response needs to be consistent. There needs to be accountability coming from all parts of the response. And so it's really important Today, we're going to see two specific aspects: the collaboration with women's sports services, and on the other hand, frontline professionals as a first-line response. But we need for all of these different agencies to be working in a harmonic way if we want to address change in the field of domestic violence. We believe that perpetrator programs should include an educational approach that integrates the survivor and safety and risk of harm for the partner, ex-partner, and children. So we need to have the safety of women and children at the forefront. We need to have risk assessment, so that's very important part of how the perpetrator programs are structured. They can be delivered both one-on-one and in group settings, but usually the preferred setting is that of a group setting, and it should not be a one-size-fits-all. There are many different kinds of perpetrators. There are different kinds of needs, so there needs to be a needs assessment, and it needs to be sort of tailored to different situations. We also believe that we need to have programs that are gender informed. We need to be aware that the dominant structures of power influence how perpetrators are able to maintain power and control over women within the relationship. So ideas around male entitlement, ideas around masculinities that cannot show vulnerabilities, that are deeply embedded in the constructions of masculinities, inform also the way in which the roots that lead to perpetration in adult men. So we need to sort of integrate cognitive behavioral elements to pro-feminist elements to maybe even form some forms of more psychodynamic treatments. Most programs use some kind of a combination of multiple treatments, and obviously mainstream programs work with heterosexual relationships, but many of these principles also can be adapted to same-sex relationships and abuse in same-sex relationship. This is sort of a little summary of sort of over time how the different programs have developed. We are now in a phase in which we have tried to sort of integrate it, as I was saying before, sort of a case management that needs to kind of assess specifically each situation, the not having one size fits all answer, but also integrating different approaches as they are appropriate depending on the typology of perpetrator, and trying to create integrated approaches that that have elements of strength-based approaches, cognitive behavioral approaches, pro-feminist ones, and also the starting point of the Duluth model with the power and control. Mostly typical program structure has an intake and assessment phase with several individual sessions with the perpetrator, and then they move into a treatment phase. There's usually a set number of sessions, usually between 16 and 30, and this is the main part of the program. Very often this is a group format, and typically sessions will be held once a week for between 1.5 and 2 hours, or 1 hour if it's individual work. From this main treatment phase, there's a final completion and evaluation phase in which there's a final feedback. In some programs, there's a follow-up. There may be reporting to the authority, and there's feedback to the partner victim. Most programs would have some kind of partner contact set up that may be more or less structured, and this is a little bit part of what we're going to be discussing now also with the next exercises. As I mentioned before, it's really important that programs be embedded within a community, which means we need to understand the community setting, understand, appreciate, and establish referral paths, and that will be also part of the presentation that Heinrich will be doing. Also ensure and publicize standards for the delivery of the program. The European Network for the Work with Perpetrator has developed guidelines for standards that have been applied in various countries with different, obviously, adaptations. Other important aspects are the fact that perpetrator programs need to be known about. They're still not as well known as we would hope. And there's always obviously the issue of the funding for the programs. Specific aspects of what does it mean to understand the community setting is being familiar with the legal context, the framework, and the practice. Also, whatever international legal setting can be of help for understanding the context. For example, in Europe, many countries have ratified the Istanbul Convention. The Istanbul Convention has a very specific framework for working on domestic violence and specifically for working with perpetrators. So that's a very relevant framework to have in mind if you're working in a European country. Considering the availability of other community services, social and child protection, victim support, the level of coordinated community collaboration among the services. This is really important because, as I was saying before, it requires different entities working together to be able to change this behavior. Consider who the key stakeholders in tackling domestic violence. Perpetrator programs cannot be developed, accepted, and sustained in isolation from the other services in a given community. So now we're going to sort of shift our focus to the specific collaboration between perpetrator programs and women's support services, but this has to happen within a collaboration also with the other stakeholders, which is absolutely central. Okay, so I am going to interrupt the sharing right now. Ask if there are any questions or comments so far.
Hi, Savita here.
Yes.
I have a couple of questions.
Sure.
Who are treated as perpetrators? Those who are accused by law, or anybody who women or children informally report to the organization? So do you have a differentiation, like you will work with this kind of perpetrators who are accused in the police complaint or in the court, or those are just informally the complaint comes to us through our community network?
So depending on the legal system and the legal referral system in different countries, you're going to probably have different percentages of perpetrators coming from the judiciary system. So in countries where there is mostly legal referrals, you would probably have 80% that come from the judiciary system and 20% that come through either other referrals or are self-referred, which means that they basically realize that they have a problem and they ask for help and they directly access the center. In a country like Italy, when we started in 2009, There was no legal pathway, so about 90% of the men that arrived were self-referred. Over time, this has changed. We had the ratification of the Istanbul Convention. There was a new law in 2013, and now it's about half and half. So half of the men are self-referred and half of the men come through the legal system. In different countries, in some countries, in the Nordic countries of Europe, men are usually self-referred. They're either programs in jail or they are totally self-referred. Like in Norway, they're all self-referred. So it depends a lot, but generally a program would be open to accepting both men that arrive directly, self-referrals, and men arriving from the system. And tendentially, they would be working in the same kind of group. They would be working together. However, as I was mentioning before, it's important also to try and assess what the needs are and recognize that there are also different kinds of perpetrators. For example, there are some specific groups that address, for example, high-risk perpetrators. There's an important program that's running in certain parts of the UK and Scotland with the DRIVE project, which is highly individualized and case managed, managing of high-risk perpetrators. Or, for example, another example is very small groups of men that are in total denial of the violence that they've done, which usually would not be admitted to groups. That work also together because they assess that it is less dangerous for them to be in some ways within sort of an evaluation process than having no services at all. So there would be lots and lots of different options and possibilities around that.
Thank you.
Somebody asked something in the chat. Do you have any?
Yes.
On effectiveness of the perpetrator program in short and long term. Also, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on how these are measures and whether they're, oh, I'm so glad you asked that. I can't get into much detail because that's sort of a whole presentation in and of itself. But actually, the European Network for the Work with Perpetrators is involved in probably the largest scale evaluation project in Europe. Through the Impact Toolkit, we provide an evaluation program, basically, that shows not only if a program, if the violence is decreasing of the perpetrator, if it's stopping, but also what kind of impact it has on the partner. So obviously there's been a lot of research around evaluation and do perpetrator programs work or don't they work. It is a very difficult area to assess for a series of reasons. It has to do with who says that the violence stopped. Is it sort of because the man hasn't been rearrested? Is it a self-referral? Are we asking the partner? Are we asking the service provider? How are we finding out? After how much time? So all these obviously influence different outcome measures that have been done over time. And sometimes the measurements or the bigger scale studies have compared aspects that were very different in terms of how the studies were set up. And I'm sure maybe Heinrich could integrate something around this because he's worked a lot on sort of also looking at all the evaluation programs throughout Europe. But currently the Impact Toolkit assesses 4 times at the beginning of the program, mid-program, end program, and after 6 months. Both with the perpetrator and with the victim. And obviously it depends on the programs. What we have found is that Impact is very good at sort of showing areas that need improvement of a program and showing if the program is actually delivering change for the perpetrators. But obviously the level and the quality of the programs does differ between place and place. I don't know if there's something you would like to add to this, Heinrich?
Well, just the importance of really taking into account who we are asking about the change. One of the most recent meta-analysis that has come out on the evaluations of perpetrator programs. So that these are studies of studies, which has integrated more than 25 studies with, I think, more than 20,000 men who had been on programs, has found, for example, that the perpetrator programs reduce recidivism as measured by official police data in around 20%, but that you don't find differences between the perpetrator program and the control group if you ask the partners. So it is very important to really distinguish between who you are asking, what is the criteria for a change exactly. So it is important to have a very broad approach, define well what the criteria for change are. So it's not only violent behaviors, but also a sense of safety, change in the relationship if it goes on from the victim's point of view. That is important. And the impact toolkit, as Alessandra has explained, is trying to get this very integrative and broad measurement of possible change through perpetrator programs.
I have a question. This is Nurun Nahar. How can we reach to the perpetrator? As per law, after proving the crime, then we can say he or she is perpetrator, right? So how can we...
I don't think I understood. Could you repeat again the question? Nuru, could you repeat the question, please?
How can we reach the perpetrator? Because as per law, after proving the crime, we can say she or he is perpetrator, right? So how can we reach them?
How can we reach the perpetrator? Is that the question?
Right.
Okay. So another really good question. I'm so glad that you asked this, because this is something that we've been doing a lot of reflection on over the past 20 years. And if you're interested, you go to the website of WWP, Work with Perpetrators European Network, and you go to the page on campaigns. You will see that each year we have a thematic campaign. And one of the elements that we develop in this campaign is a postcard that is directly addressed to men to question their behavior. So we believe that many men that are violent with their partners perceive that there is something wrong with their behavior. It may be functional to gaining control and power in the relationship, but it's not something that creates what we all usually thrive for in a relationship, which is feeling loved and closeness and intimacy. And if we address men with a language that is respectful of what they're feeling, but also that addresses the fact that they may perceive that there's a problem, our experience is that men respond to this. They respond to somebody that is willing to support and help them with something that they're ashamed of, with something that is socially and culturally twofold. Because on the one hand, we know that there is a minimization of violence against women, and there is a lot of social the English word, when everybody says it's okay, basically there's a social approval, but that's not exactly the word I was looking for. So it's not something.
Normalization.
Yeah. Approved. But at the same hand, there's also sort of a social awareness that hitting women and children is something wrong. So there are these two dominant messages, even within a patriarchal system. So we believe that it is possible. There are various examples of how this can be done. We'd have to get into more detail, but there is quite a bit of experience now that has been developing on how to address men directly, to challenge their behavior, and that is usually rather effective, because obviously if men themselves take responsibility or some minimal part of responsibility in trying to change their behavior and look for some support and help, then that obviously is a very good starting point. And actually in the project, in the Engage project that Heinrich will be talking about, we did focus groups with perpetrators in programs, and we asked them about that. So what was helpful, what wasn't helpful, how would you have wanted people to talk to you before you joined the problem, before you realized that you were violent, or called the behaviors that you were having violence. And it was a very interesting conversation, because it turns out it's not so true that men don't ask for help. They do, but they do it often. They don't ask for help saying, I've been violent with my wife, can you help me? Maybe they'll go to their GP and they will say that they have problems with depression, they have tensions in the family. Maybe they'll say that they have trouble sleeping, or that they are anxious. And so we had many men that had gone through some help requests. Some were actually quite dramatic testimonies. So men that had gone into therapy, they'd looked for psychologists, they'd gone into therapy, and sometimes they'd been in therapy for years and the violence had never been addressed. So it's not only a question of finding the right way of addressing men, it's also a question, and that's going to be sort of the heart of Heinrich's presentation, it's also a question of providing first-line professionals and anybody that's working with men with better training to be able to read what the help requests are, to be able to talk about violence, to be able to talk with men about violence, because that's actually the central finding of all these focus groups, was that men were able to access help and address the violence when service providers were able to talk about violence, when they were able to enable the men to discuss their violence, to call it with their name. They might have not liked it at the beginning. They certainly weren't easy conversations, but they were necessary conversations to be able to access help. So, sorry, got carried away by that answer, I'm afraid. Anything else? Many cultures treat violence against women and children as normal. How to help men be aware that violence is not necessary part of masculinity? I think that this is what I was mentioning before. It's true, cultures treat violence as normal, but at the same time, all cultures also have a tradition of protecting women and children. Those two things go together. So we need to bring out the contradictions that are also within men. Part of the way in which violence is addressed and discussed, and I'm thinking about zero tolerance campaigns, or the campaigns, when you have women with black eyes, or women that are stereotypically portrayed in the role of victims or stereotypically pushed to press charges or to take action against the perpetrators. That kind of portraying of violence is actually sometimes extremely unhelpful in terms of helping men to recognize their violence, because it's very easy to absolve yourself. If your violence hasn't been that severe, it's very easy to say, I'm not violent. So we also need to, if we want to address men, if we want men to be able to look at their behavior differently, we need to describe domestic violence differently. We need to make it more accessible. We need to be talking about the violences that are more common and that men can more easily identify with. Okay.
Can I just ask on that, do you think that there's do you see that there's a disconnect between how perpetrators see themselves in the community and with other people and how they are at home, as like, because they may be out advocating even for violence, being the good guy and being seen as someone that is really passionate about helping women and standing by these issues, but in the home they may be also perpetrating this to an extent, whether depending how severely, but how do you address that kind of disconnect when they see themselves as this person and don't really acknowledge that there's this whole other side that only comes out behind closed doors?
Well, that's about sort of expanding definition of violence. And that's exactly what I'm talking about. The more you have a stereotypical idea of violence, I mean, we have had the most fascinating groups based on sort of dramatic facts that have happened in the paper. And so maybe a murder, perpetrator has killed his partner. And then we will have a group of perpetrators and they will come out and say, it's just, I just can't understand how it's possible that something like this has happened. They should put somebody like that in jail. They should throw away the keys. I wouldn't even put him in jail. I would kill him directly. He should be hanged. Those are the kind of conversations that a group of perpetrators are having about another man that has had an act of violence. So it's about, and you're like, the facilitator is like a little bit disoriented, and he says like, well, where am I? Guys, what are we talking about here? And so, but then you have to bring it back to their experience, because for them, they're not violent. I mean, we had a poster when we started the perpetrator program, and one of the captions of the poster was, "Are you violent?" And the men would spend hours discussing that they weren't violent, that poster was wrong, that just how did we dare, and all kinds of things. Because the definition of violent is like, some like brute from the Middle Ages, that comes in with a club and is hitting everybody. So much so that often the men are afraid of going into the group because they think that the other violent men are going to be like brutally beating them or doing something horrible. So it's a question of what the perception of violence is, what the definitions of violence is, and how you are able to bring the examples of what is happening into the experience of the people. So if they start recognizing, okay, if I read you this scene of this person doing this, how much of this is familiar, how much is not? How much would you say is violent of what he's doing, and why? And so you start sort of learning and gaining a language to be able to recognize the violence. They are able to condemn it outside and be violent inside the family because they see it as two different things. That's the real violence, the one that other people are doing and that are good. What I'm doing is I'm just defending myself. I'm the victim here. Anybody in my situation would do the same thing. I mean, have you heard what she said to me? I mean, there are lots of excuses and minimizations that go on, but there's also the disconnect of what violence really is. Violence is something that that happens when you have a gun or a rifle, or when you leave somebody bleeding on the ground, and that's not usually sort of the everyday violence. It's the extreme part of the iceberg, but it's not sort of the majority of that. Okay. So I think that we have maybe we could do like the first part of the. Okay. So we thought with Heinrich we're going to since we don't have much time and there are different sort of experiences that you have, we want to just give a small example of what might happen. What might the conversation be like between a woman that is the partner of a man that's in a perpetrator program that is being contacted by the perpetrator program. But in this case, the perpetrator program and the women's support services don't work together, and they are sort of isolated programs. So the perpetrator program is doing the perpetrator work, the victim support service is doing their work, but they're not communicating and they're not working together. And so we want to just sort of give this little, we're going to read it, we're going to play roll it for you. And then maybe we can sort of discuss why maybe this could be problematic, and just have sort of, it's a very brief, okay? So imagining that there's this telephone call between John, who represents the perpetrator service and is working directly with David, that's a man in the program, and Mary, that's David's partner, okay?
So I'm John, the worker in the perpetrator program.
I'll be Mary.
And I'm calling Mary. Ring, 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 ring. Hello, am I speaking to Mary?
Yes, I'm Mary.
Hi, hello, glad I caught you. And now just to let you know that David, your partner, has just started to work with us at our perpetrator program. And by the way, my name is John, and I'm the psychologist at the perpetrator program in your area. And I just wanted to advise you that if you need, you can contact the local helpline or the local shelter.
Okay. Glad to hear it. He really needs help. His temper, he can lose control sometimes. So, is there a support service for me?
Well, not from us, unfortunately, but I wanted to let you know that you can go to the shelter if you need, or ring the specialized helpline.
I'm confused. Let me think about this. He will attend, but how will I know what he's learning or what I should do differently? I'm afraid that he might be angry that he has to attend this program because it's my fault. If I had not made him angry, I let him down. Where should I turn to talk this through?
Yeah, I understand, but I'm sorry, we are working with David only. You can discuss your fears, though, with the shelter or the helpline.
Does the shelter contact you if I have a question or need to report on any new violence?
Well, not really. We do work separately. We work with the men, the shelter works with women and children.
So if things get worse, I tell the refuge, but they do not tell you?
Yeah, but if he stops attending, if he doesn't come anymore to our program, we will let you know.
Okay, I tell the refuge, but they don't tell you, and you keep working with him. If he says he has not been violent, you believe him, even if he has hit me, and you won't know?
Well, yeah, that's right. We will work with David to address his behaviors, and we hope that you will see the difference for the better. But we won't be talking to you directly again. I'm sorry, we're just a perpetrator program. We just work with the men. But as I told you, there are special women's services to talk to if you feel afraid or need help.
Yeah, I know. Look, thanks, and I hope it will make a difference. But I need to be honest. I am disappointed that you don't want to hear from me during this time because I know David. I know him inside and out. He will say, our trouble is all down to me. Maybe he's right. He thinks that I'm useless, and he will tell you all the bad stuff about me, and I don't have a way to give you maybe another side to the picture. He lets things get to him that maybe should not get to him.
Yeah, I know. I hear you. But we cannot get into taking sides, We can only offer a service to male perpetrators. I understand your concerns, really, but I'm sorry, we cannot do anything but give you advice on where to turn to. Do you want me to read you out the number?
No, I have it. I have been to the shelter before. Thanks anyway. To go now. Goodbye and good luck with helping him out. I hope it makes him feel less angry.
Goodbye, Mary. Thanks for taking my call.
Okay, so any ideas on why that maybe is not sort of ideal?
It's not ideal, but it's realistic. The reality is like this. So I could realize some of the women complaining about the same thing, that what others are doing with their husbands, they don't know. And so people think that there are shelter houses who listen only to women. Men feel that. And then the perpetrator program listens only to men. That's what women feel. So there is nobody who is listening to both of them. We can't be judged, but we have to listen. So both feel dissatisfied at the end of the cycle of the program. That's what I can see from the conversation you enacted in front of us.
Yeah. But of course, it doesn't have to be that way. If the perpetrator program and the women's support services are collaborating, if there is a conversation going on, if the woman can communicate with the perpetrator program, if there are new episodes of violence, if there's protocols that have to do with considering that the victim voice needs to be heard, then the setup of how the perpetrator program responds to the woman and works together with the women's support service would be a different story. Any other comments on?
I think this the potential risk factor in terms of the violence potentially increasing if in case the perpetrator program is initially bringing up a lot of feelings and a lot of shame and anger in the perpetrator, and he's taking that home, and that and that comes out in violence with his partner. That is a big concern. I think also just the accountability mechanism just does not make sense in terms of actually addressing the whole issue, not just the perpetrator's version of it. And I think obviously it would be great if things just work, they just do a program and it's one-sided and it just works like that. But I just don't think that's a magic trick that anyone has the capability to perform. And I think that I think also if the women's services are in touch with the men's services, they can also prepare the woman or the partner to on different ways to handle what's coming up as well and empower her in the situations that do come up. And also I think having like an emergency kind of like function where both services are like alerted would be beneficial as well, because it's all well and good to be like enrolled in something and ticking all the boxes, but practically, like, what does that look like in terms of safety and actual like progress in that space?
Okay. Thank you for that input. So I think I'll pass it over to you, Heinrich.
Okay. So as Alessandra said, we will now look at another important part of the collaboration between perpetrator programs and the community and other services. In this case, the frontline services, so social services, health services, child protection, could even be police, any service that has a first direct contact with men, and to see what they can do to address domestic violence and abuse in the men they work with. I will start sharing my screen if I can. And as Alessandra has also already mentioned before, we did run this project called Engage to help frontline professionals to address gender-based violence or domestic violence and abuse with their male service users. So we'll talk a little bit about the project idea and aims and the needs analysis that Alessandra has already mentioned a little bit. And then I will briefly introduce you to the roadmap that we developed on the basis of this needs analysis and the training package, and then give you some brief insights on the pilot implementation and evaluation that we did, and we'll hopefully have some time for questions and discussions in the end. This is, I've already said that, what we do at Connexus. So the project idea we've already mentioned really mainly had to do with helping frontline professionals to address gender-based violence in men, not only in victims. As you probably know, and we've had this experience talking to professionals in social and health services many times, that there are many protocols and guidelines and quite a bit of training on addressing gender-based violence or domestic violence and abuse in victims, women especially, also to some extent children, but very little guidance and very little training on doing that with men. And on the other hand, different studies, amongst others by Marianne Hester and her team at Bristol University, have shown that many of the men who come to a perpetrator program do attend health or other services in the months before entering the program. So there are opportunities to catch them there, to address their violence there. So there is a clear need for guidance and training on addressing perpetrators for frontline professionals. And on the other hand, on our side, on the side of the perpetrator programs, many of the programs, we did a survey a few years ago with more than 100 programs from 22 different European countries as part of the Impact Project. And more than half of them work with men who are self-referred or referred by other services who are not court-ordered. So there is also a clear need for referrals from these frontline services on behalf of the perpetrator program. So the aims of the project were then to increase, as everything we do according to the Istanbul Convention, as everything we do with perpetrators, with men, is to increase the safety of women and children. In this case, by promoting improvement in the coordinated multi-agency response, specifically by improving the quantity and quality of referrals to perpetrator programs, but also to start a shift in perspective on a more political, or if you want, social level, from making the victims and survivors responsible for their own safety and for stopping the violence, to holding perpetrators accountable also for at the level of frontline services already. The specific objectives were to build the capacities of the frontline professionals to address and then refer perpetrators to programs, and to improve the coordination between these services and the programs in the line of what we just heard before. The project we ran in 2018 and 19, we were coordinators in Connexus, and we had partners from France, from Italy, both CAM and the Florence City Council, and from WWP in Germany, and we had very important input from our advisory board, Marianne Hester from the University of Bristol and Neil Blackrock from Respect. And this was a project funded by the European Union through the Rights, Equality, Citizenship program. So these were the three phases of the project. Really, we started out with the needs analysis, running focus groups and interviews with frontline professionals on the one hand, on their current practice, working with men and detecting violence with men on our programs, and also with some experts in the work with perpetrators. We did a review of the literature, and we also based, of course, the project on our experience in the work with men and training professionals. So on the basis of this needs analysis, we developed both the Engage roadmap and guidelines for frontline professionals and the training package, and then implemented those in a pilot implementation and evaluated the results. We'll come to that towards the end of the presentation. So within the needs analysis, as I said, we did qualitative interviews and focus groups on needs and on their experience in the referral pathways with 18 men. And Sam has already mentioned some of the results of that. We did focus groups with a total of almost 100 frontline professionals, most of them from social and health services, also some child protection, some police, around their current practice in addressing gender-based violence with men, around coordination between services, referral pathways, and of course also with regard to their needs for guidance and training in this aspect of this theme. And we did interviews with a total of 12 experts working with perpetrators to somehow validate the initial ideas for the training and roadmap. So the main results that we had from the men on the programs that we did interviews and the focus groups with, and as Alexander has already mentioned some of it, most men had not ever been asked about their violence by any professionals, even those who have been in long-term psychological treatment. And what they said that they would have liked to be asked, and how they would like to have been asked about it. And those who have been asked said that it was helpful or important to discuss the use of violence gradually and start giving words to it, especially to not to be or feel judged. We've already talked about this monster theory, the perpetrator. I've done all this, but the perpetrator, I'm not the perpetrator. The perpetrators are the others. But also to be given a perspective of change, the possibility of receiving help, receiving support. And they mentioned that it was sometimes difficult, really, even if they were looking for a specialized program, to find information. So somebody also mentioned that already, the importance that this information is readily available to the maybe few men that have an interest and have a motivation to take it. From the professionals, most of them had never received any specific training on addressing domestic violence and abuse in men. only less than half knew a perpetrator program that they could refer a man to if they had detected violence in the case, and less than 20% had ever done that, so they had ever referred a man to a perpetrator program. But practically all professionals had at some point or the other identified or at least suspected that there was domestic violence and abuse in one of the service users. But far less had addressed this detected or suspected violence. So very few had actually then asked about it and tried to do something. The main obstacles that professionals mentioned were the lack of knowledge and skills to do so, the man's denial and minimization, we've talked about that. Also the fear of putting victims at risk, the fear of losing rapport or a therapeutic relationship, so the fear of an angry reaction on the part of the man that could make him abandon the service, but also fear of the man's possible violent reactions. There were also some legal or deontological concerns. So what to do if there are no legal facts, if it's not proven really by law that he is a perpetrator and has abused violence. And of course, the normalization of violence and the own prejudices and positions towards violence and men who use it. And in some cases, also the impact of violence on professionals' personal life and how that affects their disposition of talking to and working with a man who is using violence. Important part also of the training later. And please, if there's any questions, don't hesitate to just unmute yourselves and interrupt me. I can't see you all, so if there's any question, please don't hesitate to unmute yourself and just go ahead and ask it. So we developed this roadmap, and we'll have the information sent as one there. Information they're all on the WWP website, readily available in different languages. The roadmap to help frontline professionals do this job of identifying gender-based violence, asking about it, motivating men to seek help, and then, if that is successful, referring them to a perpetrator program. And this is the table of contents. So there are some initial chapters on power, control, the consequences of violence and abuse, the importance of ensuring accountability of the man and the victim safety, the relationship that we as professionals can establish with the men who use violence and the importance of that. But then the main body of the roadmap is on the 4 steps that we suggest: identifying, asking, motivating, and referring. And then there's an annex with quite some tools and extra resources that can be used in this process. And on the other hand, we did develop the training package, which includes a PowerPoint presentation, also a video of a man talking about his violence, which helps us to somehow experiment and experience the emotional effects of listening to a man talking about his violence and how that can affect our way of relating to him and our possibility of working with him and addressing this issue. And also includes practical exercises, role-playing for each of the steps that we suggest: identifying, asking, motivating, and referring. There is a document on guidelines on delivering the training, and what we did mainly, actually, I think you too, Alessandro, you have been delivering the training after the project. We've been using it here in Barcelona both for social services and for the Catholic Women's Institute. We've been running these trainings now regularly. We usually do 1 or 2 initial training sessions with the main content, the main body of the training over 6 or 8 hours, and then 2 or 3 months later, usually 2 or 3 months, not 3 or 6 months later, we have a follow-up session, a booster session, where we somehow review how professionals have been implementing what they've learned, interpret this. Sometimes we do kind of a supervision, look at cases, look at what's been difficult and why, and how to overcome these barriers, or also what has been working well and successful. So these booster and follow-up sessions have been shown to be quite useful for professionals and for really guaranteeing implementation into their professional practice later on. What's important in the training and also in the roadmap, of course, is to make clear what we expect from the frontline professional, what their role is, and that it's not really to provide special services that change process for men to stop their violence and abusive behavior. This is what we do with the perpetrator programs, but they have an important role in holding the man accountable and doing these 4 steps that we suggest, that they should be able to identify gender-based violence in their male service users, not only in the female service users and the women, but also in the male service users. Identify the violence and abuse, address it, and then if possible, refer them to a program. And we've talked about the importance of the coordinated communities response, so the safety and well-being of women and children has to be our priority whenever we work with men, be it in a perpetrator program, be it in a frontline service. So anytime we must bear in mind what the effects of our actions, of our interventions are for the victims. And as Alessandra said before, the system matters. It's important that there is a coherent and coordinated response by all the services and parts of the system. And this means that for victim safety, it is very important to really guarantee that any information that's provided by the victim, maybe through a telephone conversation like the one we role played before, remains totally confidential for the victim and is not passed on directly or indirectly to the men. To be very aware of the expectations that women might have about the perpetrators change. So there might be false expectations, and that's one of the reasons why contacting the partners on behalf of the perpetrator programs is also important. Of course, any kind of couple counseling or family therapy or mediation has to be avoided. It can be useless in the best of cases and very dangerous in the worst of cases. We have to be aware that there is a possibility that perpetrators try to manipulate us as service providers as well as their partners. And it is highly important to always make sure the man is held accountable for his violence, and that we avoid any form of direct or indirect victim blaming, passing on any kind of responsibility on the man's behavior or even the man's change process to the victim. And on the other hand, it is important to really provide specialized support to the victim survivors, risk assessment, empowerment, safety training, recovery, and again, that there is a good coordination with the support services. So this is one of the part of the training where we talk a bit about who the men are that use violence. This idea of the monster theory, we always imagine the man on the left-hand side, and it's difficult for us to imagine that the other smiling guy can as well be a perpetrator as the other one. So we do work a little bit about the ideas and myths about men who use violence and abuse, because these, of course, affect our ability and our way to address these situations and the responses we give to the men we work with. So some of the most frequent myths are that they will never change, that they're only violent because of alcohol or substance use or mental health problems, or that they are, despite their violence, good fathers or totally useless at all in any respect of their fathering. Or, for example, that all perpetrators were abused as children or have been living in violent homes themselves. So we do work a little bit about these myths and try to deconstruct them and transmit some of the knowledge that we've gained through years of experience and research, that there's no single profile of a violent man, nor a single causal explanation, but that, as we know, violent behavior is due to a complex interplay of factors, and we can use the ecological model to show the range of different factors on different levels that are usually at play in generating the use of violence. And also the traditional models of intervention are usually not sufficient to change or stop the violent behavior. That there is important that there's a specific adapted concept of intervention to address the violent behavior. And again, the importance of holding men accountable through this coordinated community response. And this is a table that we use to show the importance of having like a balanced relationship with the men that we use, and not fall into a very harsh confrontation that would not let us create a working relationship with the man, to be able to really address and question his thoughts and beliefs and his violent behaviors on the one hand, but on the other hand, avoid also a collusive relationship where we do not question these behaviors and thoughts. So we need to find this balance between a clear positioning against the use of violence, against the thoughts and beliefs that justify and underpin the use of violence on the one hand, and also a relationship where we do try to understand the man's experience and history, so we are able to create this relationship, working relationship that is able to hold the questioning that we need to do with it. So let me see how we are doing with time. Let me just quickly run you through the 4 steps. We would start with step 1, identifying domestic violence and abuse in men through different signs and indicators in the man's discourse and behavior. So usually men would present to services for health-related problems. Could be psychological, could be psychiatric, also sometimes relational problems that, as Alessandro has also mentioned before, might mask the problem. So they would usually not ask for help, saying, I'm a perpetrator, I'm being violent, I need help, but they would ask for help for other problems. Sometimes following a crisis, after due to an assault or after an ultimatum by part of the partner who says, if you don't do anything, I will leave or I won't come back. Sometimes accompanying the partner to medical appointments where men tend to appear very efficient and attentive, friendly. It's sometimes difficult to imagine again that they using violence at home. And also sometimes as fathers, because of issues related to their children, it could be health services, it could be around visitation rights, it could be child protection. But again, rarely will the men spontaneously bring up the issue of their violence and abuse in any of these situations. And therefore, it is important, if we do not systematically screen for the violence and ask all men that we work with about the possible use of violence, that we are alert to possible indicators or signs both in the men's discourse. This would be talking about any behaviors that do constitute different types of violence or abuse, or referring very jealous behavior or controlling behavior over the partner who was always to tell her where she is, etc. So these are typical behaviors around control that we could identify. It could be any misogynistic attitudes or sexist comments that the men might make during the sessions, be it about their partner specifically or women in general, or any kind of euphemisms, any kind of expressions that could indicate any of the above, especially expressions like, oh, we had a big fight or we had a strong argument. This might ring a bell and you might want to ask what exactly happened, what exactly did they do, what do they mean when they talk about a big fight or a strong argument. These are typical minimizations, or could be typical minimizations in this. Also, there are indicators in the men's or in the partner's behaviors. I don't want to go through all of these, but sometimes it could raise some suspect. It could be an indicator that the man always wants to accompany the partner, wants to be in the interviews, in the sessions, even for routine visits, insists on being there, and we might notice some disappointment in her that he's coming in. It's more clear when he speaks for her, interrupts her, corrects her, doesn't let her talk, or even devalues her or tries to make decisions for her. He might justify or minimize any possible consequences of the violence, which could be injuries or psychological, emotional states by the victims. He might be blaming her for his problems, showing difficulties in managing his emotions, anxiety, or stress. So he might show, even in the sessions, mood swings, raise his voice. And sometimes we observe apparently contrasting attitudes. He can, on the one hand, he can be very silent or defensive, refusing to answer our questions, or on the other hand, be really overly talkative, compliant, very friendly, smiling, even too present, and especially during the interviews together with the partner. So these are all possible indicators in the behavior that we can see. If there are threatening attitudes or gesticulation, the invading of this partner space, or maybe even of the professional space, if they're violent or abusive directly, it's of course very, very clear. So if they do it in a public space, like the session with us or the waiting room, what will they be doing at home in a private space? As we said, trying to manipulate or control not only the partner, but also us as professionals or the situation. So the kind of issues that should or not be talked about in the session, the type of questions that should be asked, the duration of the interview, how it go, it's over. These can also be indicators of a possible use of violence and abuse. Disqualifying female frontline professionals, or showing demeaning or aggressive attitudes towards female professionals, sometimes also flirty or sexual attitudes. And then it's especially interesting to observe any differences in the partners and the victim's behavior between the sessions with her alone and the sessions together with the partner. There are marked differences. This oftentimes is an indicator that there could be a situation of violence and abuse. So in the training, we would use a case study to try to train professionals in identifying these signs and indicators through a case study, and would then pass on to second step, which is asking them about domestic violence abuse. Once we have identified any indicator, we have suspected that there could be a use of violence. And it's important that we create an environment of privacy and safety that allows it for him to disclose their use of violence. And so that's important to clarify the conditions of confidentiality. Of course, they have to do with this legal situation and professional situation kind of service that we are working in as professionals. And as we said, that for many men, being asked about violence is important, and it is okay as long as they feel respected. And some of them are almost relieved to be able to talk about this issue with someone. Of course, it's important not to address the issue of violence in the presence of the partner, and to do it with progressive questions from more generic to more specific and focused. And in the roadmap, we suggest these funnel questions, two types: the general ones, where we start asking about the couple relationship more in general. How is it going? How would you define your relationships? Then going further on to more specific questions that are around conflict. So most couples argue at times. How do you and your partner handle your conflicts and disagreements? How do you act when you're angry? What happens when the anger gets worse? Do you think your partner or children might be afraid of you at times? Have you ever done or said anything that you later regretted? So we start with questions which are more general about the relationship, and then, of course, depending on their responses, we would dig further in to possible different kinds of violence that they might be using. And on the other hand, we have these specific funnel questions that have to do with the presenting problem, with the issue that the man comes to our service for. For example, if it's a health service, it could be stress or alcoholism, or it could be jealousy. And we can then use this presenting problem as some kind of a pretext to start talking about the possibility of violence. So how has stress affected your relationship? In which ways? What does your partner think of your problem with stress? How does it affect her? When you are stressed or jealous or drunk, how do you act with your partner and children? When you have been very stressed, have you ever lost your calm and done anything that you've regretted? What exactly did you do? So again, it's the same process, but using possible presenting problem that we've been working with the man as somehow an excuse, and make it easier for him to use this excuse to somehow disclose his use of violence. I was stressed, I was jealous, I was drunk, and we then later can explore whether this violence also happened in other situations or just under the influence of this specific problem. If the man has acknowledged, recognized a certain degree of violence, it's important, of course, to explore this violence further. If indicated of a high immediate risk, we of course need to take measures to protect the partner or children. which might include reporting to the relevant authorities, the police, etc. And then we could explore different types of violence, areas of violence. We can use some checklists, and the roadmap could provide some checklists that can be helpful for that. And we can also just explore in a conversational way the first episode that he remembers, or the last episode, the more serious episode, the worst episode, or most typical episode. These are different ways that we can use to explore the violence the man uses, and to also already recollect some information on the negative consequences this violence has on his family, but also on himself. Going into violence and substance abuse. And then we would have another case study exercise on asking through these funnel questions, asking about the violence, using the same case study that we used in the step 1. What we could do in the training. And then if we've had affected and confirmed through the exploration the use of violence, he has acknowledged it. Of course, it is important that we motivate the man for a possible change process, because most of the men would be at least ambivalent about this, or even resistance about the idea of asking for help and going through a change process in a specialized program. And from our experience, it is usually a lot more helpful to try to accompany him to identify his own reasons for a possible change, reflecting, as I said before, all the information that we've gathered in the exploration around the consequences of the violence. So to reflect that to him, helping him identify their own motivations and reasons to change, rather than trying to convince him or almost coerce him through a moral discourse. And what we suggest, and we don't have time to go into that in detail here, in the roadmap and training, is to use models of invitations to responsibility by Lynn Jenkins and the motivational interview by Miller and Rolnick to help activate this process and guide this process of creating this more internal and own motivation for the change process. There might be typical motivators that we can try to use. It could be fear of legal sanctions, typically not wanting to lose or to getting back the relationship with a partner or family. One of the strongest motivators usually is to be a good father, and to help them see that using violence against the mother, they cannot really be a good father, and that violence almost always has consequences and effects in the children. Usually is one of the strongest motivators when they realize the effects that their violence has on the children. And most of the men we work with, this is a changing point. It helps them really to want to make a change. Sometimes when they come from violent hope, it's not wanting to be like one's own father. Generally, as Alessandra said before, many of the men we work with realize that violence is a block to having more fulfilling relationships and a more fulfilled life. So this realization helps to motivate them for a change process. I'm not going to go into these examples on even the invitations to responsibility. Again, we would use a role play here to practice with the professionals in the training these motivational strategies with man. And finally, and this is very, very short really, the referring man to a perpetrator program part is really helping professionals find out about the programs that they have in their regions, that they can refer to, get the relevant information so they can prepare the referral well, give realistic information to the man about why he's being referred, where he's being referred to, what are the benefits for him, but also what are his duties, what are his rights, what to expect from the service, but also what are the conditions of taking part. We actually do recommend that they contact with the programs, find out about who the contact person is, what the referral pathway is their protocol, and also to agree about a mechanism of feedback and coordination with this perpetrator program, a specialized service, especially if the frontline professional, for example, in the health service, will be working with the man, and to see how we can support the man's participation in the program, but also to monitor this. Important, as we said before, not to refer men to anger management or couples counseling or therapy or family therapy, which are not helpful or dangerous. Now, very, very briefly, or maybe we can skip this part, Alessandra, what you think, and give some time for questions. This is just information on the implementation that we did in the 3 countries. That's maybe not so relevant.
There are a couple of questions.
Okay, I'll stop sharing.
Are there different inputs for different age groups of perpetrators? Do you differentiate between first-time abusers and repeat abuser? Does the input content change accordingly?
Okay. No, there's no differences between the different age groups. The Engage program project actually was thought of and developed for adult perpetrators and frontline professionals working with adult men, but I think it can be adapted to young people. Maybe some of the indicators would vary slightly, but in general, this is an issue that, apart from the Engage project, we are worried about, that we all know that there's a high prevalence of violence, especially in adolescent and young people's relationships, and that on the other hand, they don't tend to attend services, they don't tend to ask help. So it seems important to train, and what we do at Connexus in Barcelona now since a few years ago is to try to work closely together, both with the universities and also with some leisure activity groups, plus with high schools, to help early detection in a similar way. But there's within the Engage project, there are no different inputs for the different age groups. And about the first-time abuse and repeat abuse, there's no systematic differences here in the project. Actually, the indicators, there, of course, the consequences of repeat abuse might be different, but as far as the indicators and the ways of addressing it, usually would probably not change much. Of course, in the exploration of the violence and in the consequences that we might then use for the motivation, we might find, of course, differences, but these are differences then in the content of the process, not differences really in the approach that we suggest. I don't know, Sandra, if you want to add something to that.
No, that's perfectly fine answer to mine. I just wanted to say that, repeated, Heinrich said it, but all these materials that Heinrich was talking about are available on WWP's website, the European Network of the Work with Perpetrators. So yeah, that's the website. You can find the roadmap, you can find the training slides. Somebody was asking about these slides that we have in the presentation. I'm fine with sending them to anybody that is interested. I'll just leave my email in the chat box, and you can just.
You have mine.
And I can send them. Is that okay with you too? Are you? Yeah, Heinrich, you can if you're available. Yeah, there's a Heinrich email, heinrich@connexus.cat, so he can send his.
My presentation, actually, most of my presentation is part of what's on the PowerPoint for the training. I mean, there's some introductory, some of the implementation slides that are not in the training PowerPoint, but most of it is there. But I'm also happy to send you this presentation if you are interested.
I had a question. I've got a couple. Let's see how it goes. But just in terms of, so this training goes to frontline workers. But I suppose what I've been learning about, like, the rates of domestic violence in certain professions, which also include police and stuff. What do you think the barriers are around, like, addressing the reality that these people that are potentially supposed to be recognizing and referring are also potentially the ones doing this, and yeah, how is that even being addressed, or how can we tweak that? Because I guess that would affect the way that things are being dealt with, because they would also have to in turn acknowledge that they may be a part of the problem that they're trying to address in their job, but in their personal life. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, generally, if we work with gender-based violence, domestic violence, one of the big issues that it affects almost all of us, practically all women in one way or the other, and directly or indirectly also many men. So this is why we have this more experiential part of how what kind of emotions does this issue and does the man's discourse, the man's violence, and spoken to a violent man, what does it mean for us? What does it generate in us as professionals and as persons? Emotionally is part of the important part of the training. We have not specifically addressed the question that you pose, which is interesting, that yeah, some of the professionals might be perpetrators themselves. They would probably not be addressing the issue, wouldn't be using this much, or would be maybe doing so in this dissociative way that we've talked about before. I do this, but I'm not really a perpetrator, so I can still do my professional role and dissociate from my own violence. I mean, we've done training with police, and of course you find quite a lot of resistance there in some of the men that we work with.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I think what I'm thinking about is do you know if there's a capacity to be able, like, for organizations and all, like, on all levels in terms of, like, companies and services that provide this kind of support, for training in how to like recognize this kind of stuff for victims and perpetrators and address it as like a kind of occupational health and safety type thing, but it's compulsory. Do you have any knowledge around that at all? Or would it be if it's not?
Yeah, I think in the UK there has been some work around taking this to companies, to organizations, and make it part of their policies. I think it's a very important and interesting avenue to also include the workplaces as a site of detection, prevention, detection, and then referral or intervention, depending on what's possible in the different company or workplace. But yes, I think that's an important issue. As I say, I think there are some initiatives in the UK. I don't know, Alessandra, if you're aware of.
Yeah, I think there are various things going on. I don't think we are aware of everything.
Most of it, again, more directed at women, victims, survivors.
I think there probably have been sort of experimental things. I don't think anything important and structured has been done on this.
Yeah, apart from compulsory, as you say, which would be interesting.
One more question that I wanted to see if anyone else has, because I'm talking a lot.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to check, like, what kind of skills or learning do you think are like most beneficial in this space and working with perpetrators? Because obviously there's a lot of different learnings and stuff you can do, and for me personally, I'm not sure what is most effective and what is like worth doing first. If I'm interested in working in this space for a career, like communication wise, psychology wise, social kind of.
I don't know what Heinrich thinks. I think he can speak for himself. I think that you need a base in sort of people skills kind of profession. So that would be social work or counseling or psychology or something like that. And then a specific training on perpetrator work, like the ones provided by RESPECT or other in the UK. And then you need the possibility of doing some kind of internship and work, seeing sort of working in groups or working with individuals. That would be my recommendation.
Yeah, I can only agree to that. Maybe there's a possibility to without having the formal training, to do some kind of internship or to sit in on some of the groups to get a grasp of what it really is then, and then take a more informed decision of whether you want to dive into that or if that might be your thing. I don't know if that's possible, but in some organizations they would probably offer you a possibility without having the training background.
Thank you.
Also, sort of an anecdote linked to what you were asking before on sort of training professions where there is also a high incidence of perpetrators. I've had experience with working with the police, but actually I think that the fact of having worked with perpetrators for many years actually puts you in a really, really good position of actually helping even when you're training, when these issues come out. Because first of all, you're usually going to be talking about perpetrators in a way that is respectful and sort of sympathetic of the struggle that many men feel. And that already usually touches a chord that creates maybe an ambivalence listening or raises a lot of questions. if you then combine that with also having sort of a little bit of a different approach when you are defining violence, so giving a broader sense of what violence might be. I remember one specific, it was like it's a police academy, and one of the police, detective that came up to me afterwards, and he said, well, if all these things going on, that means that you're in a situation of domestic violence? And I said, well, potentially. He said, well, how would I know how many of these are required to go through that? I said, well, good rule of thumb would be to ask your partner if she's afraid of you when you have conversation. And then he walked off. And then when I was leaving, at the end of the day, he called back and he said, she said sometimes. So evidently there was all this going on in the back of his head, but he did call his partner and he asked her if she was afraid during the conversation. So he was asking himself questions around this. So I think that actually doing training on perpetrators, also with the police, if it's done in a certain way, can really often offer a lot of thought and enable. Maybe they won't get into a program, but it does enable them to maybe look at things differently when they're not themselves involved. So, Laura and Savita,
yeah, that's an interesting experience you shared. Yeah, it happens many times. Yeah. At least when women come to him complaining, he will have a different perspective to look at the complaint, and maybe whatever is legally available in that country, he will take those actions. That's good.
Okay.
Yeah, it was good. It gave me a lot of insights. Like, as I said, I had never worked with perpetrators, but we do work with boys and men about gender equality, preventing and addressing gender-based violence. So some of the ideas you said, like the funnel questions, I really liked. I mean, we can't do it in a consultative mode because we don't have that kind of expertise, but we can use those ideas in a different way to sensitize people, to identify how they are behaving and how they can change their behavior. So it was, I could connect some of these points directly to what I'm supposed to do in my project. So it was really good.
Great, thank you.
Thank you so much to both of you.
Thank you.
And Laura, if you are going to make an app, let's know. Yeah. I'm interested. I mean, we have so many apps on our mobiles nowadays, but still it could be a good, because of COVID, we can't really go and meet communities. So actually in my project, it's like a dropout girls, but we are now using a tablet to teach them numeracy and literacy. So some of the app questions, like if you are going to develop, that could be a good entry point to communicate with families as such. So it would be good. So best of luck for you to develop such an app.
Thank you. Yeah, I could
know
for ages. But yeah, it's obviously really close to my heart. And I think the idea kind of came because I was having these conversations. I decided to actively have these conversations with the men in my life because I realized that I hadn't. And this is obviously the way overdue. And then I was finding that I'm spending like 4 hours on calls with them. And it's, first of all, I'm not an expert. I can only share my experience, but it's also draining. And I was like, there's got to be a better way than me like actively speaking to everyone I've ever met about issues in a way that they can still have these reflections and be kind of thinking about things in a different way and looking at how they're contributing and potentially, better ways to do them. So yeah, in a nutshell, that's kind of what I'm
It sounds like it's about 3 apps, but
I want to frame it as like something that they can use. It's like a tool that they can use that will help them with communicating, relationships, mental health, well-being, professionally as well. But it's like that's the core, is like addressing these issues, because I do think addressing these issues will help with all of that stuff in terms of connection with self and others.
Yeah, with these modern smart watches and the biofeedback thing, you might even have some alarm when they get too angry or something like that.
But maybe like if there's like a situation where they are getting those feelings coming up, they can go into a certain part of the app and like just have a vent, or like maybe there's like a preemptive questions that they can like work through what's going on for them and how to kind of de-escalate themselves, because I think there's a lot of potential to build a lot of different features into.
Just like COVID-19 app, it asks us if you have symptoms. You assess yourself. If you have symptoms, then you have to like go and check and do test or whatever referral service is needed. So maybe just to make people aware, because many times, like even as a person, if like I know I'm getting angry, the anger vanishes. So sometimes just observing your thoughts and feelings makes you calmer, so that can help people, especially during the pandemic time. That would be really useful.
Yeah.
Laura, what's your background? What's your training? What's your background?
Honestly, I've been an executive assistant my whole career for 10 years. So organizing and planning and like problem solving basically. But I'm very caring, and in my spare time I've volunteered a lot since I was a teenager. So I think that like an app would be a combination of like the caring and the super organized, like get things done kind of skill sets that I have, that relationship building in.
But I think you're really creative. I think you're really onto things. Your mind works in a very interesting and creative way around topics that at the moment really need it. They sort of need creative thinking and different ways of putting things together. I like the way you function. I think that there's some really interesting and potentially positive things. Stay in touch.
Yeah, I'd love to, absolutely.
With the network,
so
with the European network. Yeah, we creative.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Okay. Bye.
Thank you so much.